And then now that we have some amazing attendees joining us today, I'd also like to acknowledge that Royal Roads University lives, learns, and works on the traditional lands of the Kosepsum and the Songhees families. And learning has been happening here for long before, since we arrived. So we're really grateful to be here. And since I'm working from home as well, I'd also like to acknowledge that I am as well on the lands of the Kosepsum and the Songhees families. So I'm really happy to be here today and to be having you all joining us. And with that, I am thrilled to pass it off to our lovely presenters for today. So I'll pass it over to Dr. Robin Cox, who will take us through some more of our conversation this morning. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Christy. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for showing up and participating in this webinar, Reimagining Education as a Catalyst for Social Change. I'm going to just review the agenda first and then talk a little bit about what inspired this webinar before we move into some presentations. So we really will start with a general kind of acknowledgement of the context in which we find ourselves today, all of us, in these sort of challenging times with intersecting challenges. Then each of the panelists will have an opportunity to present short presentations, 5-minute presentations, to share their thoughts on the question of how education can act as a catalyst and where we're at with the education systems, etc. We'll have a short discussion amongst the panelists because I know that each time we have met to talk about these ideas that we'll be sharing today, we inspire a lot of discussion amongst ourselves because each of us brings a different perspective and orientation to this question. So we'll have a bit of a discussion amongst panelists, and then we'll open that discussion up to engage all of you and bring in your wisdom and intelligence and experiences into the discussion about education as a catalyst for social change and transformation. And then we will close out. We've got about an hour and a half in total. So with that, I'll just sort of launch into providing a bit of context before we go into the actual presentations. And we can probably lose the slides now, Christy, until we need them again for some of the presentations. Thank you. So really, this webinar has been inspired by some ongoing conversations and shared experiences and observations of all of us on the panel about these intersecting and complex challenges that we're experiencing in this moment in our shared history. Obviously, COVID-19 is a critical component of that. COVID-19, which has exposed many of the historic and ongoing challenges and vulnerabilities associated with dominant culture, including our trend towards globalization and the ways that this has exposed some of our supply chains and created some vulnerabilities related to our small world made through global trade and travel, economic systems that encourage this kind of rapid cycle of consumption and waste that are contributing to not only climate change, but also really to the kinds of problems that we associate with COVID, our dominant cultural disconnection from the environment and from nature, our greater exposure to the creation of these kinds of novel viruses that underlie the COVID pandemic, because of our increasing and rapid urban populations and this move to urban environments and the encroachment on habitats that is bringing different species into closer contact with humans. And doing so in crowded environments where these kinds of viruses emerge from. Obviously, all of that arises within the context of climate change, which prior to COVID-19 was front and center in the headlines and has really been replaced by our conversations and questions and concerns and news about COVID, but remains really the most pressing challenge of this time in our human history. And is very much, as I was saying earlier, connected to the kinds of viruses that COVID-19 pandemic is arising from. The Black Lives Matter and Indigenous rights campaigns and protests that are erupting and have been, steadily part of our world, but have been exposed and highlighted through the current protests, and focusing attention on the inequities that emerge from globalization, that emerge from our continued ways of othering each other and privileging some people and some species, for that matter, over others. So these intersecting challenges that we are seeing in the news, that we are experiencing in our daily lives. And so this webinar came out of that kind of context, but also our ongoing discussions here at Royal Roads within this team and within other members of our community about the role that education plays in our society. And I would say that every one of the panelists here today and others attending from Royal Roads has a really deep passion for education, for thinking about education as not only a business, not only about building a skilled workforce, although that is important, but also education as this fundamental way of opportunity, really, for building capacities for interest in a culture of and willingness to address these issues of social justice and environmental degradation and the kinds of changes that modern culture is demanding of us, and that is being demanded of us by these intersecting challenges like COVID and climate change and Black Lives Matter and Indigenous rights. So in response to these conversations that we have been having, we wanted to have this webinar really explore the role of education, and not only look at the how or the what of education, rather, the focus, what kind of content and subject matters we focus on, but also the how of education. How have we constructed education? How have our education systems been basically designed to deliver education, and how might we reimagine education and educational systems to become more of that catalyst for social justice and social change, and that deep root of education as a powerful tool for building the capacity for change and transformation in our communities and our societies. This morning I was listening to, or prior to this webinar, listening to CBC, and somebody was being interviewed about the current emergent kind of conversation in education about how we manage to bring back, or whether we should be bringing back face-to-face, and how we imagine having younger children come back into the educational system, and this interest now emerging in these systems about nature-based learning and learning in the open of not only open education, which we'll talk about later, but learning in nature and on the land. And I think that's a great segue to our first panelist, to Russ Johnston. And I'll just allow each of the panelists to really introduce themselves. Russ is our Indigenous educational advisor at Royal Roads, and I'll turn it over to you, Russ, reminding you and all the other panelists that you'll each have 5 minutes before we move into a shared discussion. Russ?
Miigwech Robin, Ani, Bojo, Minogi Gajeb, Shungila Wanka, Indigenous, Neashin Nigaming and Dunjaba, Wabazishi and Dodem, Abitan Kosepsan Minwa, Lakwanganaki. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Robin, for your kind words. And as she mentioned, I have the honor of carrying the role of the Indigenous Education Advisor here at Royal Roads University, which is a new position, but is also an exciting space to be working from. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to talk about what reimagining education as a catalyst for social change looks like, and especially from an Indigenous lens. It's a really interesting thought, because the more work I do in this space, the more I'm realizing that I'm not creating anything new. I'm looking at things that have been done for centuries and thousands of years. And what we're doing, or what we're looking at, is how are we incorporating these? How are we creating equity around these sets of ideologies and ways of being in the spaces that are currently dominated by Western ways of thinking and being? So I introduced myself this morning in my language. I am an Anishinaabe from Southern Ontario. So my opening piece, Shungila Wanka Indigenous, that's my name. My name is Shungila Wanka. It is actually Lakota, and it means sacred fox. I was gifted that name when I was young. And what that name represents is the gifts that have been passed along to me to carry with me as I walk forward. And so that piece sort of ties into one of the things that I think when I reimagine education, and that's relationality. Who am I? What do I bring? Where do I come from? And what is my relationship to everything that I am connected with? And that first piece, when we introduce ourselves in our language, it tells the people, it's almost like presenting a resume or a CV. My name is this, and with that name becomes a set of roles and responsibilities with which I carry forward and I bring to every space that I have the pleasure of occupying. And that second piece, Neashindigaming and Dunjaba, that is my homeland. So my homeland is Neashindigaming, which loosely translated to English means a body of water surrounded on 3 sides by land. So when I asked my grandma, who's a fluent Anishinaabe speaker, she's like, yeah, it's like harbor. Just tell people harbor. It's easier to translate. But what I'm doing there is I'm self-locating in where A, my language comes from, B, where my ideologies and my teachings come from. So in an Indigenous lens, the land is our teacher, the land is our educator. And in each land, in each space that we have the pleasure of occupying, there are certain lessons, certain languages, and certain things that come from that place, which ties into that relational piece, right? Then that second piece, Wabazishi Nindodem. So I am of the Martin clan. And that sort of ties into the introduction of my name. We, as an Anishinaabe, have a clan system that regulates our communal processes. And so as the Martin clan, we are the warriors, the scouts, and the hunters. So once again, placing myself relationally to my role within my community, the role that I have on the lands, where those teachings come from. And that last piece, Abitan Kosupsin Minwa Lakwonganaki, I right now am a visitor on Lakwongan and Kosupsin territories. So I have the honor of being a visitor here, but I also have a responsibility as a visitor here to walk in a good way and to be in a good way while I'm here. And so those 3 pieces, when I think about what that means to education as a catalyst for change, one is relationality. What is our relationship to education? What is our relationship to ourselves? What's our relationship to our families, our relationships to our communities, and our relationships to our nations? And I think at the root of those, realizing that all of these things are interconnected and that you have a responsibility to all of those spaces is a key piece of thinking about what this work is and what it can be. That second piece is our relationship to land. The land provides us all that we have, all that we need. And in our teachings, the land doesn't need us, we need the land. And so how do we walk in these spaces? How do we carry ourselves? How are we symbiotic? How do we reciprocate the gifts that are given to us and the teachings that it provides us? And how are we returning to those traditional teachings that provided this space for all of us to enjoy now? And that final piece that I kind of like to talk about is the decolonization and resurgence piece. And that piece, to me, comes in 2 parts. One is creating spaces within the education systems that we have, of reassessing the systems that have created where we're at, and creating space for new conversation, new ways of thinking, new ways of being. And then as an Indigenous person, what resurgence looks like. So a returning of our culture, a returning of our language, returning to our relationships to land, and doing work that we have done for a long period of time. And I'm grateful to be here today because as we think about what decolonization looks, it's about being in these spaces. It's about being a part of the conversations. It's about being given an opportunity to share our worldviews and to engage in an equitable space as we move forward with this work. So it's an honor to be here this morning. Miigwech and Haichkasiya.
HKCM. Thank you, Russ. It's a beautiful segue when you're talking about sort of reimagining and being part of these conversations and how we can shift those conversations to our next panelist, Irwin Devries. Irwin is an educator, an associate faculty member here at Royal Roads, and a passionate advocate and proponent of open education. And so I'll turn it over to you, Irwin, to introduce yourself and share your thoughts.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Russ. It's nice to be able to follow up on such wise and kind and thoughtful words. And if we could get the slides up, please. My passion is helping to grow access to higher education through open learning, distance education, and that's where my interests lie. Next slide, please. So at the moment, and I'm going to choose COVID as an example of what the kinds of things that we're talking about. Right now, we're dealing with a flood of issues that seem to be overwhelming us, and we tend to use emergency measures like sandbagging here, and they make perfect sense when there's a flood. That does not substitute for longer-term water management or climate management, but it's a short-term thing. So anybody who's been involved with short-term planning, filling sandbags, getting us through, our students and our institutions through this time, I salute you and congratulate you and thank you for your work. We also at the same time have to ask questions like, to what extent are we going to put our student and faculty and staff health at risk? Are we going to fall into a death spiral of Zoom lectures? And we know that not everybody is crazy about that. Do we outsource online learning to proprietary companies? So do we use emergency decisions as a template for the future or just hope it all just goes away? So next slide, please. The first default we tend to think about is towards planning, technology, facilities, operational capacities, and enrollments and so on. And these things are important, but also if we look at our technology for education as a pedagogy, we've already done a lot of that work and I think we tend to forget it. We have our strategic plans, our educational philosophies. And this is the learning and teaching and research model from Thompson Rivers University, which talks about applied and authentic learning, caring, community-based, transformational learning. There are some very key concepts here that can really provide strong foundation and guiding lights to the way we move forward as we become more mindful and thoughtful, connecting to the future, connecting to our students and communities and to the land. And so we don't need to let technology or the ed tech industry be the driver. We do have these capacities, they are there. Next slide, please. And one of the opportunities that opens up to us is a greater awareness of open education in a broad sense of an open ecosystem. And in this particular graph, we see things like open data, open science, open source software, open access publishing. And we don't have time to delve into those right now, but when you think about even with COVID and the research that's going on right now, how would open science help connect the data that's available rather than data that's different in every province, every state, every country? Imagine open access publishing where the information that's found could be shared as quickly as possible because it's free and freely available. Imagine the types of learning using pedagogies that access all these different kinds of open resources and bring all this knowledge into the community. So we're talking about community-controlled processes and technologies, the potential to lower cost to students who are going to face big financial challenges, because our institutions are going to as well, getting more into interinstitutional collaboration and sharing, while at the same time, we have to consider student data and privacy. So seeing past online learning is one way I phrase it, and moving towards a community-based learning model or the community as resource. So we're not just talking about technology, we're talking about a different model focusing on community. Next slide, please. So here's just an example of how it works in developing the Master of Arts in Climate Action Leadership McCall program at Royal Roads University. We started with open pedagogy as an assumption, which came as a direct desire from the program leadership. We looked at those dimensional details. We looked at the framework from the Resilience by Design Lab with things like place, partnerships, purpose, and process. We looked at the learning and teaching and research model, applied and authentic, caring and community and transformational. And from that, we looked at some examples of what are the tools, what are the technologies, what are some of the processes that we could use to actually enable those. You'll see a mix of proprietary and non-proprietary. It's always a continuum. You use what you have, but we're just moving in a certain direction. And a great amount of learning technologies and activities in the curriculum development is now being shared with all the faculty in the program. Next slide, please. So our last slide, what does it take? We engage the institution at all levels. It can't just be top down. It can't be one-off faculty initiatives. Those are all different places where they can start and sprout and grow. But in the end, all the parts of the organization can be involved with this, and starting from the roots of the educational goals, the values, the missions of the organization. So, and I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Irwin. I think, again, this idea of connecting, I mean, building from what you were talking about, Russ, and now Irwin talking about this open orientation to education as another tool for potentially transforming our agenda as educators and as the educational system. And to do that work requires design. It requires, designing curriculum and designing programs and designing how we do our education in these new creative and potentially more transformative ways. And that leads me to our next panelist, Ken Jeffery. Ken Jeffery is also an associate faculty member and an instructional designer here at Royal Roads. Over to you, Ken.
Thanks, Robin. So yes, I'm a full-time, I wear a couple of hats at Royal Roads. I'm a full-time instructional designer. I work in the Center for Teaching and Educational Technologies. And I also teach in the School of Education and Technology as associate faculty. I'll speak today, and of course, we're keeping it brief, and I really appreciate the lead-in that I got from both Russ and Irwin, because I'm going to carry on a little bit with that. My job and my role in my career is really about me continually examining the role of educational design and how it supports the goal of learning. Robin mentioned how. I'm often thinking about how. How do we make learning work? How do we make it work for the learner? And as Irwin alluded to with his sandbag analogy, there's been plenty of debate in my field around, is face-to-face classes better than online classes? And I think we're missing the point a little bit when we start dividing and going down that road, because it's not about whether face-to-face or online is better. There are situations for both. But my goal, or what we hope to achieve, is that education design isn't just about stringing together a series of lectures. So even if we were to have an emergency shift to online, as Irwin mentioned, we don't want to put up a series of Zoom, the death spiral of, lecturing by Zoom. We're trying to build learning experiences, encouraging education through practice, where the learner is a co-creator of that space. We look at learning to be members of a community. And this keys back to something Russ mentioned about relationship. Because learning is more than just the technical uptake of information. Paulo Freire, talked about the banking model. As an instructor, I can't just open a student's head, pour in a bunch of data, and say, oh, there you go, I've given you your information. We look at it more as a balance between the cognitive and the social domains as equal components of the learning community. So we're striving towards a participatory worldview of learning. We learn, and as we learn, or let's put it a different way, as the learner, the student, and I consider myself a learner at all times as well, as we learn about the world, we are also acting upon it. We're within. So we're developing ways of knowing through narrative, through action and reflection, and that learning journey becomes as important as the destination. So there's been a real shift and a real move and a desire, particularly in my field, to move us away from that, lecture and then ask the students to answer questions on an exam. We want to build a more holistic experience where the student is centered in the learning and able to be themselves, which leads to my next point, which is learning as self. We encourage and want to invite the learner to present their real self, not just in class, but they're as part of a larger community. Education benefits when we incorporate the human element, because education is a moral endeavor. We're improving people's lives, and it's not in these small cases, but to the world. So successful negotiation of social change requires awareness of one's own and others' values. That being said, it's not the role of the teacher to attempt to impose their own worldview upon the student. Again, we're moving away from that. So we want to encourage dialogue. The learner brings their own experience. We all arrive at education with our own backgrounds, our own learned knowledge, our own thoughts that we have developed over time, and that learner's view reflects their situation and is a reflection of their own self. So as I work on design, educational design, I'm always aware that I'm not able to, the learning happens, of course, in the student or the learner inside their own brain. So I can't just put information into someone's brain. I have to try and design a process, a community, a learning community, where that can then happen in full. So the goal there is to create an experience where learners are able to access information, have access to subject matter experts, and hopefully the greater commons. In other words, the student should be able to reach beyond the traditional walls of academia, and many components of the open model encourage that. If I were an instructor, I'm not just the sole repository of information for the students. Students need to practice self-mediation. They're taking part in an educational process and are encouraged to navigate their own learning experience. And they do that as self-actualized individuals, able to present their real self, empowered and engaged with capacity for criticality. So I often look at critical pedagogy and how that can influence and benefit us all, instructors, faculty, staff, learners, in that learning community. It's not a closed community of learners, but we want to engage with the wider commons. That being said, that all sounds very challenging. So it's a matter of me continually learning how to build and design and help people construct courses and programs that encourage and fit within that greater paradigm. And I will stop there with that. It's a challenge.
Thanks, Ken. And
thanks, Robin.
As somebody who works directly with Ken on trying to accomplish what he's saying, it is a challenge, but it's also a great an exciting opportunity to, again, to really think through how to make this system and this profession and our shared learning as dynamic and engaging and powerful as possible. And that leads me to our next panelist, Elizabeth Childs. Elizabeth is a professor at Royal Roads and the program head of Royal Roads' first open pedagogy, open educational program, the MA in Learning and Technology. And so I'll turn it over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Robin. And thank you everyone for making time in what I can only imagine is a rich and full day on your end to come and be part of this conversation. I'm just seeing some of the comments in the chat and I'm so excited to dive into our discussion further. And I always, when this group get together, I always have made pages of notes already. I think before I sort of launch into my piece on online communities, one of the things that Russ said in the introduction really resonated with me, and it is, you know, where do your ideologies and teachings come from? And I think we often in our day-to-day get lost and forget to give time for that. And so I thought I'd give you a little bit of sense of where mine have come from over the years. I grew up rural in a place called Buckhorn, Ontario, which is across the lake from Curve Lake. And we grew up in a tourist resort. So my first quarter century of my life was spent in service of others, and in service of others in the hopes that through different experiences, as you do when you come away to be on vacation, you create space in your mind and your body to stretch and do things differently. And so real focus for me throughout, when I look back, throughout the work that I've done over my career thus far has been around community. It's been around connecting people. It's been around relationship building. And it's been around connecting people with this experience that allows them to broaden, to enrich, to deepen their understandings of multiple perspectives, their appreciation for what could be different, and the hopes that that helps them just reconnect a bit with themselves and what's important to them as they move forward. And so one of the things that's kind of knit those threads together for me and my current work has been working around online communities. And so I'm going to change us up just slightly. I'm going to put a link in the chat here. And it's a link to work that I've done with some colleagues in Ontario around what a fully online community model could look like. So it's a little 4-minute video clip. And I just encourage you to open a new browser window, cut and paste the link that's in the chat now there. And you should be able to just click on it and see the little video. It's posted on YouTube. So it should play. Hopefully, fingers crossed, technology is on our side. And we'll just take the next 4 minutes. So on my clock, it's 4 after the hour, rather. So we'll take the next 4 minutes to just watch this, and then we'll be back in this space. So I think you may just be wrapping up and getting just about finished with the automated voice that goes with that.
Elizabeth, I had no idea that you grew up in Buckhorn. I grew up in Lakefield.
I kind of wondered.
Yeah, no, as soon as you said that, I couldn't help but laugh. And then it, you know, I just, yeah, speaking of relationality right there, totally.
Well, precisely. And I think the thing that's really, you know, in all the work that I've done internationally, you know, people always ask where you're from, and I always say Buckhorn, and it is a very, for those on the webinar, it's a very small little town, but we do have a statue of a buck that we're very proud of. And it is surprising, wherever you go, there's always someone who seems to know someone who was connected to that. And I think it goes back to Russ, to your point, right? This sense of interconnection between, and in the work that you saw in that little video, you know, between people and technology, between people and each other, between people and the land and your work, between people and these virtual spaces that we're co-creating. And so I'll stop there because I know we have one more panelist to do an introduction, but looking forward to the ongoing discussion and conversation. Thanks, Robin.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So I'll introduce myself as a panelist, as a facilitator and the panelist. I'm the program head of the MA in Climate Action Leadership here at Royal Roads. I grew up actually in Vancouver and on the lands and unceded territories of primarily the Musqueam and Squamish peoples, and I now live here in Victoria. I have the pleasure and privilege of living here and working here. I have been teaching at Royal Roads for the last 13 years in the Disaster and Emergency Management Master's Program, and it was in that context, in the context of my research with the Resilience by Design Research Lab, that I really began growing the idea of this new program, the MA in Climate Action Leadership. And a lot of that came from this idea of not only education as transformation, but very much growing out of the work in disaster emergency management around this concept of resilience. And I've used that word to name the research lab that I run, the Resilience by Design Lab, recognizing that the word itself is problematic and challenged and critiqued, as many of these abstract conceptual words are, because they become to sort of mean everything and nothing. And I'm talking about resilience in this context because I think the kinds of changes that we are talking about, whether they are around decolonizing and anti-racism, whether they're around reconnecting to the land and to nature and to each other, practicing greater openness and transparency and relational learning, this kind of intentional design, whether it's online or face-to-face or some other creative combination. And I think that one of those key concepts, kind of bringing those together, is this notion of resilience. And so resilience is used often to I think initially and in a very simplistic way that I certainly don't agree with, but it has been used to talk about sort of getting back to, returning to normal. How do I bounce back? It's evolved in disaster emergency management and in the world to mean many other things, including, you know, we talk about resilient hair products and resilient communities. But I sort of think about it at the very basis as the capacity that we have individually and collectively to not only anticipate and prepare for and try to minimize the suffering of these changes that we can't avoid, but also to then look at the changes and participate in the changes that we want to make, and that also is a component of resilience. So in that sort of way, I choose to reclaim the word, recognizing that every word that we use, transformative, resilient, all these abstract concepts get co-opted and can mean almost everything and nothing, but that we can also reclaim those words and reclaim what we do in the same way that we're talking about potentially in some ways reclaiming the word education and reimagining it. You know, recently at Royal Roads, our president, Philip Steenkamp, shared a new vision for the university. And there were 3 key words that came out in that vision: caring, courage, and creativity. And so I've been thinking a lot about those and how those, what those imply for education at Royal Roads, what those imply for us as an institution and in the courses and curriculum that we design, and what those and how those connect to the work that I do, which focuses and centers so much on this notion of resilience and working, whether it's working with young people or professionals or teaching in classes. And so when I think about caring, I absolutely think about the relational quality that of learning that you were describing, Russ. This idea that we of empathy and connecting with each other and connecting in these social spaces in learning that both you, well, all of you have spoken to. Ken, you spoke to it in your presentation. This idea that caring is about connecting and that we have to have empathy. We have to be able to understand as much as we can and stand in the shoes of others. So it's certainly about that kind of caring. But caring also is describing our passion, what we care about in the world, caring about the world that we live in, this precious blue planet that we are we have the privilege of being a species on, and that we seem to be carelessly destroying. Caring is about all those things that we connect about and care about, and education is one of them. And that brings me to the next word that sort of defines that vision, that courage, you know, because I think caring requires courage. It requires the courage to be self-reflexive about how and why and when, etc., we are all complicit in and contribute to some of the challenges that we are struggling with. The courage to be honest with ourselves and say, this is who I am. This is a white woman, white settler, the privilege that has accrued to that, and how do I use that in ways that support these agendas of social justice and transformation, anti-racism, etc. And how do I do that in the context in which I work professionally and spend a great deal of my time in this educational system? So courage is kind of like the foundation of caring, I think, and a foundation of resilience. It really requires us being able to stand openly and honestly, engage with these challenges that make us uncomfortable, and the uncertainty that makes us uncomfortable, and the things like COVID that make us uncomfortable and fearful, and still continue to be self-reflexive and move forward. And that brings us to the third word in that constellation of caring, courage, and creativity, because I see creativity as a huge part of resilience and transformation. This capacity for looking at what needs to be changed and creating and recreating, and not necessarily recreating what we are comfortable with and what we are used to, but reimagining and creating from that space, and understanding that our willingness to engage with our creative selves and our creative and the creativity of the universe, and really say change is the only constant that we have, and we have an obligation, we have rights, and we have responsibilities that go with those rights to really look around and see not only what changes are occurring and how we adapt to them, but what changes need to occur and how do we lead those changes. And for me, that is a huge component, and that's sort of the richness that I choose to reclaim in the word resilience. This idea that if we are to be a resilient educational institution, a resilient educational system, contributing to a resilient society and world, that we need all three of those things: courage, creativity, and caring, and to bring those into the work that we do as educators, to bring that into our learning, and bring that into our shared engagement with each other and the environment in which we live. So with that, I want to open this up into a conversation amongst the panelists. We'll take about 10-15 minutes and then open that up just to sort of see what has been sparked from all of these presentations, and this sort of intersection of these ideas that each of us have presented. So what is it that we're calling for? What is it that we are thinking about when we think about this reimagining of education at this moment in history, in our history of this country, and our social history, and in this moment in time where all these intersecting challenges are calling for transformative change? Panelists?
So I'll jump in and start with something, because then someone can build on that. One of the things that resonated as everyone was speaking, of course, were the threads of community and design and connection and relationships. And then Russ said early on about how the land doesn't need us, we need the land. And that has really got me thinking about this virtual land that we're living in these two worlds. And lots of writers talk about how you can be online and offline, and then there's a writer that talks about being on life, which is basically the merge of the two, right? And so how are we navigating these virtual spaces that we're co-creating, that now globally many of us are spending a lot of our time in, that have lots of impacts and effects on both our mental health, our physical health, the environment. And so I think that when we think about reimagining, and we think that premise of the land doesn't need us, we need the land, and we think about our virtual spaces, that gives us some cause to pause, right? I mean, Irwin's summary of open was an amazing way to sort of contextualize the possibilities and challenges. And then underneath that, what's pinning it? Could we do open without the virtual spaces? Could we do online communities without virtual spaces? And so do we need to really focus some more care and attention on what these spaces are? So that, just as a jumping off point, I offer that as a start.
And that care and attention to these spaces, I'm curious about also, I'm not putting you on the spot, Russ, but, you know, sort of thinking through what you shared around Indigenous ways of knowing and being. Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. And this connection to land, and this emerging conversation in certainly in K-12 around shifting into the outdoors. I just wonder about what thought you have on that.
No, I think it's I think what we're finding, or what I find in this position, is how are we translating this into our current sort of Western systems, right? You know, from an Indigenous lens, there is no, I mean, returning to the land is, I mean, it's just part of what we do, right? I mean, our way of being is rooted in all of those things, right? And I think sometimes the struggle and the work that we do is how are we translating this quantitatively into a Western system that doesn't always honor these relationship pieces, right? And I think that's where, you know, sometimes with the weight of objective ideas in that system, that subjective piece doesn't get as much value. You know, what I take out of you know, being on the land might be different than what you take, or what Ken takes, or Elizabeth, or Irwin. But the reason for that is we're at different spaces, we're at different understandings, we're at different, you know, we have different needs and different things. And I think that's where the land is capable of providing those teachings individually to all of us. And I think an incorporation to, you know, into this is going to allow students to pick and to choose and to build their bundle or to build their toolkit in the way that they need it. And I think that's, you know, one of the incredible things about learning from the land is that what I take from those spaces might be completely different, but it is going to teach us all something, and it's going to teach us in a good way. And I think that's where, you know, if we shift to what that online learning looks like, is maybe approaching it that way, right? You know, how are we utilizing this tool? What am I taking out of this? What are you taking out of this? How are we utilizing these tools to be able to build these things, you know? And I think that's the exciting part about the work that we're doing, right? What does this translation look like? You know, how many voices can we bring together? You know, it was beautiful to see where everybody, you know, mentioned where they were coming from. And I mean, this was literally a global conversation where we have this opportunity to come together everywhere, right? And in each one of those spaces is a different set of teachings, a different way of being on the land and in those spaces. But here, this online tool allows us to engage and to be together and to speak about those things in a space that didn't exist, you know, previous to these things. So I think it's an important piece, and that it will ground us in the work that we do as we move forward.
And yet it's also very, I mean, one of the critiques of online learning is that it, you know, it's a bit disembodied, right? I see your face here, I sit in my chair, and I'm not necessarily, well, even connecting to myself, let alone connecting to you and connecting to the land. So these are some of the challenges of online learning, surely, that it has both this potential to connect more broadly, because of course we can connect, and I know there are people on this webinar from across the country, from Nova Scotia, from Ontario, from Alberta, from BC, and at the same time kind of take us out of our connection to each other and the land by that. And I wonder if anyone has some thoughts on that.
Well, maybe if I could throw in an idea, which would be that I think when we talk about online learning, that very term seems to imply that our learning is happening in this virtual space and using these technologies. And it's kind of a reductive view that says that that's where the learning happens. And then when you shut off your computer or put your phone away and go and doing something else, that's stopped. And so we've completely denied the place, the physicality, materiality of the places where people are learning and where they are studying. And then we've lost a huge resource. If we think of, there's a term that's been around for years, distributed learning, and it means different things. But if we think of online learning, not just, unless we're talking about just doing Zoom lectures and that's it, which I think is sort of a very dystopian way of looking at the future. But if we're looking at the technologies that we have and the virtual technologies to help connect us both to each other and place us in the community with a view of a community as a resource, then we can do so much more. George Velichanos recently did a great webinar where he talked about, I think he talked about instructional design, but I think we could also include our ideas about technology, which is that historically we look at these in terms of effectiveness and efficiency, and then in an increasingly sort of humanistic, pedagogical way, they're looking at engagement, that become more engaged. But then there's a fourth E, which is equity, and I think we could broaden that to the idea of social justice, human needs, safety, health, privacy, community, all those kinds of things, that if we go in with intentionality, the intention of wanting social justice, of wanting to see safety, health priority, if we want to see in community, then we can look through our technologies and use them and deploy them in a way that that builds out of that vision of education and learning, community, land, and so on, rather than just saying we're just in this virtual online space and we're kind of trapped here. So there's a thought on that issue.
I think that's a really good point, Irwin, because we often get locked into seeing learning as being event or place-based, right? Everyone who has had children at home during various stages of lockdown, it's like, okay, go do your online learning at this point, right? Well, it doesn't actually. That's the first touch, right? And we often talk about how when you're doing a reading, you're going to have to read it 3 times, right? And graduate students think, oh gosh, that's too much. But you really do, right? That first pass is just an orientation to, okay, now I start to see a different lens. And then you get deeper. And I think, people go away from a face-to-face interaction, from this kind of interaction, from purely asynchronous online interaction. And the learning has just begun. They've just started to knit together. We know that. We know that from how our brains work, that those neurons are just starting to fire in a different way. And the synapses are just maybe inching a little bit further and growing new connections. So to bound it in, is face-to-face or online better or place-based better, the learning doesn't happen just in those individual instances. It's this ongoing journey. Every moment is different, right?
And as one of the folks in the chat room has pointed out, that it is absolutely true that different learners, different learning requires or is based in different ways of learning, right? So that for some folks, online is actually a freeing kind of learning environment, because it can allow for greater time for reflection and potentially different ways of learning. So it is true that these systems that we create and are talking about will work differently at different times and extend into the world, as you said, Elizabeth. They're not just contained by the course or the book or the online or face-to-face platform that sparks the initial learning. I'm curious about whether there's been a number of comments in the chat room around K-12 and my interpretation of somebody saying, I'm seeing a lot of the death spiral of assignments and predetermined endings in those systems. I don't think it's only in K-12, and I just wonder I mean, I think that is true. We have very structured, we've landed in a place where our education can be very much centered on specific and sometimes quite narrow outcomes. And I just wonder how some of these other, you know, like open learning and some of these other mechanisms of learning either contribute to that or might be used to counter that kind of narrowness. Ken, do you have some thoughts as a designer?
Yeah, I often think of the, and I think someone just, I've been trying to keep up with the chat as well. Someone just mentioned that the LMS, which is the learning management system, I think in many ways it takes on these artificial digital walls around our course. So even just the ability to move out of an LMS into something that's more open like WordPress sometimes will allow for that shift. We tend to think, well, I mean, I still think of our classroom as, you know, the walls of, you know, I used to teach face-to-face, and now I'm teaching more predominantly online. And it is that shift to allow the that openness to get out of that. And I often question just the idea of learning management system. What does that really mean? I'm challenged by that. What are we managing really? Are we managing our learners? So breaking away from that, I think, helps. And that's a mindset that I constantly challenge myself to move beyond, because it becomes an online defined space.
I mean, it's interesting that you bring in that word management, because I think I mean, whether it's an appropriate word for learning management systems, but we have a very management orientation to learning, and just the word itself implies something. It's like there's a control over it. There's sort of we manage things as opposed to exploring or unmanaging them in some ways. And I feel as though, I don't know. I don't know. You know, I'm newer to open, and I definitely a component, significant component of the design of the program, the Climate Action Leadership Program, and how or whether open learning and open pedagogy can shift that narrative and that construction of a sort of a very managed and controlled orientation to learning and education, not losing what some of that offers, which is, you know, standardization and ideally sort of an equitable access. I'm not sure that actually applies, but anyway, just curious about your thoughts on that, any of you.
I'll jump in, and then I know Irwin will jump in because there's lots to comment there. I think one of the things, and it just picking up a little bit from Colleen's point in the chat too, is this notion of, so why the LMS? And historically, traditionally, it was for tracking purposes, right? And so if we're tracking, what are we tracking and why are we tracking it? And for whose benefit? And so I think that's where it starts to intersect with open, and I'm gonna turn that over to you or jump on in.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about tracking, and Audrey Waters just recently wrote a post reflecting on someone else's writing about this idea of almost like this policing of education that seems to be growing with things, you know, with proctoring, online proctoring and so on. That whole surveillance state is growing. And when you connect that to what's going on in the protests going on, the so-called riots, I mean, in most cases, protests, valid social speaking to injustice, and the potential for tracking and so on, and to what extent we want our students to be living in those environments and being treated under that sort of assumption of suspicion and dishonesty and so on, whereas when we start with an assumption of more trust, we build trust as part of an open pedagogy. We build much more personalized resources. They're empowered to create their own resources and share those, so things can be much more localized. There's a lot more, I think, grip that happens to the learning that happens, and it moves in a different way. Open textbooks are a part that are growing very rapidly. BC Campus here, Campus Ontario has done some great work with that. where teachers can adapt the textbook for their own particular area or for their own particular interest. And they can even be generated in community. There are open projects where students are helping to write the open textbooks for their own courses. We were just looking in the course I'm teaching right now, the student was just exploring sites where you can write your own exams or your own questions and share them with other students as a learning activity. So it's kind of a break away from that structured policing, suspicious kind of approach towards a more open, trusting community base. Now, open itself doesn't do that. And Sarah Lambert recently in her research talked about the idea that open is not determinative. It doesn't have its own agency. It's about the intentions that we bring to our learning and to our technology, back to what we believe in as educators and what we trust and what we want to see modeled in ourselves and our students modeling and carrying out in the community. That is what will really change how we go about doing our things and the technology that we use. And it will by itself awaken us to the technologies, the environments, and the approaches that we need to try to get away from, because in the longer term, they're not going to help us. We're not providing as educators the leadership that I think that we need to provide.
Yeah, and I guess when I hear that and the earlier discussion, it raises a question that for me resonates a little bit. I don't want to assume I understand exactly what you're asking, Sandy, but earlier you talked about sort of the Eurocentric focus of our current education systems and raised the question, if students have been exposed to one way of seeing the world, how does student learning actually change the status quo? And how is, asking us as panelists, how is our curriculum anti-racist and inclusive? Which sparked for me a thought. Audre Lorde talks about you can't use the master's tools to change the master's house. It's like that recreation and the earlier discussion that we had, where Russ, you had challenged that notion even of, how do we make education inclusive, and that notion of inclusivity. And I wondered if you wanted to pick up on that thread around, can we use this system that is created out of, a colonized orientation, a Eurocentric perspective. Can we use this system? Can we transform within, or do we need an entirely new system?
I appreciate you putting me on the spot on this one, because it's one of those things where my initial answer is no. These are Western foundational systems built from a worldview that does not create equitable spaces for differing views. I mean, and that's just me being honest. And that's a tough thing for me to say as somebody who is invested as the Indigenous education advisor in a Western institution, right? But it doesn't change the work of creating space, creating conversation, and creating dialogue, right? I mean, what you do is you fight for those spaces, and those spaces will shift and evolve, and you find new spaces and create new ways and new dialogues and new relationships to these things, and I think that's where, back to your quote of Audre Lorde, right? This system is built to be this way. It functions this way. It's not broken. It's not this. It functions and honors a certain way of being and a certain way of doing, right? And I think this is where sometimes I've become really frustrated, where perhaps the world that I want to see, the world that I want to live in, probably isn't going to happen in my lifetime, right? But it doesn't mean that I don't keep doing the work and creating spaces. And for me, the post-secondary environment is where I think I can be most effective to create change and dialogue, right? And I think that's where, when we talk about these types of things, is critically assessing and analyzing the systems with which we function in, right? And how are we shifting dialogue in these spaces? What are we honoring and what are we valuing here? That learning management system, to me, it functions in a way, and I understand what it is, but also just it makes me cringe, right? The learning part I love, but this management, right? Like a very Eurocentric way of, hey, we can control everything, right? That we, you know, much like that concept of manifest destiny, our relationship to the land is this thing to control, it's this thing to manipulate, it's this thing to shift and alter, and it's a resource, right? And the systems piece is, you know, the part that makes me sort of laugh is that it is a system, right? You know, that we've created. We have come up with this. We have decided that this is how we should function and go through that, right? You know, from an Indigenous lens, to us, there's only one system, and that's that natural law, that the land and the earth will take care of itself, and with it, a certain set of teachings, and that is ultimately the only system that is going to matter at this stage, right? And so, having said that, it doesn't stop the work. It doesn't stop us having conversations, creating spaces of reassessing, you know, how we value these things, how we quantify these things, and what our relationship is to these things. Because I think when we can really critically assess the systems with which we're operating and shift the dialogue around those, we will start seeing the change that we want to see, and we will shift what we value and how we go about doing this work. Because I think what we've seen in the last little bit is that the systems that we have, they're not working. They aren't.
Right. No, I mean, I think that's, if it hasn't been clear to most people by now, it's certainly hopefully clear now. I'm just looking at a question that's been posed by Alana, who said, I'd like to hear more about where the tail is wagging the dog. If we really need an overhaul, is it going to be about ed tech, research, policy, or frontline educators making this change? How do we know the culture is shifting? And is it time for a national focus on education? Open to any of you. And perhaps, you know, in asking the question, Alana, and giving my voice to your question, I'll say, is it time for a national focus on education? I actually think it is. I mean, it's been a conversation in COVID around, you know, where and how to spend money. And it's not only about money, but this is a real moment in time where I think the role of education, the structure of the system, its capacity for change or incapacity for change should be part of the national conversation. It is such a critical component of where we spend time in our lives. I mean, if you think about how much time every individual spends in an educational system and then beyond in terms of our learning, et cetera, and how we've connected these things to, you know, workforce skills and workforce ability, and how we've connected it to all these kinds of ways of being in the world, and how the education system currently reinforces some of these things that we can clearly see are not working for any of us, really. I mean, they're privileging some of us, but they're not working for us. You know, they're creating you know, climate change in a way that, you know, we will quickly run out of our capacity to adapt to what is coming at us, and we're taking a lot of species with us. So, you know, how it should be part of a national conversation, but I'll open that up to the panel. So should it be part of a national conversation, a national focus, and what is it we're calling for in this overhaul? Elizabeth, have you got some thoughts?
I was just, well, those are big questions, Robin.
They are big questions. They're a version of Alana's questions, but I think they're important questions.
They're important questions, right?
We're talking transformation.
I think people in the educator space get a bit nervous around the national focus because they think of national top-down directives, right? They think of curriculum for the year piled on the corner of a desk, and you work from top to bottom, and it's November, so you must be on page 7 of textbook 4. And I don't think it needs to be that. So to your point, I think that the system of education, I would hope collectively as Canadians, we recognize as a valuable thing. Education is a valuable thing. It is a human right. And so if that is the case, then being able to elevate the conversation at a national level so it's not watered down into different political and then down into the districts, and then from the districts, now it's the school boards that are going to make the decision, and then it's the individual schools that will make the decision. I'm not saying the decision matrix has to be at a national level, but elevating the conversation to that level, I think, is where we need to start really moving. Because all of these other pieces you've mentioned, Alana, like ed tech, research, policy, how the working environment is for frontline educators, some provinces, there's 2 different unions between educators and administrators. So there's lots of these little idiosyncrasies and complexities. But unless you have a national forum to have those conversations and help others see the multiple perspectives that are in this ill-structured, messy problem, it's really difficult to iterate what it could be, because you're always iterating based on just the little bit that you know, or that you've touched, or that you've been involved with.
So there's both a large conversation, but not reducing it to a top-down and I mean, you didn't use these words, but this very sort of, it's this very narrow output outcome that we have designed for what could be a very expansive agenda for education.
Absolutely. I think often in K-12, and I by no means purport to be an expert, but in watching and working with K-12 educators over the years and being one, there's always been this sort of sub-conversation about how education has to be beyond the school. We need to involve the community in education, and community from the standpoint of museum programs and special interest groups and all of these different perspectives. And so I think this interesting space we're in right now has allowed us to see, what can some of that look like as you tap into research networks that have offered 10-week programming around different aspects of the environment, as you tap into Indigenous communities who've been able to put together curriculum to support during those early 10 weeks of the pandemic to widen the voice, as you tap into coast-to-coast networks that have been working on ocean and climate change and creating curriculum for K-12 learners. So you start to see that it doesn't have to be just educators in our public school setting that can be involved in children's learning, in our learning, right? So it can be broader than what our system compartmentalizes it into.
And there are examples, Russ, you've talked about, a deep history in Indigenous learning that is a different example of worldview or perspective on what learning is and could be. There are others, I think of agricultural extension learning and how learning can extend into the community in different ways and learn from the community. And this comment by Stacy about, which I think is really important, which is this, getting away from these silos where we have a focus on K-12, we have a focus on higher education, apprenticeships, etc. But it's not an integrated, often not, these conversations are not integrated and sort of connecting to the fabric of this larger picture of what education is or could be. I don't know, Irwin, Russ, anyone else got some thoughts on that?
I'm going to jump in real quick here, and I think this is, sorry, Irwin. Because I had an interesting relationship to that question that was asked, right? This idea of national focus. Well, across Canada, there's so many Indigenous nations that are autonomous spaces that have been created, right? I mean, we're looking at this as a function of Canada. Well, I'm looking at this as a function of an Anishinaabe way of being. I'm Anishinaabe before I'm Canadian. My people have been here long before Canada as a concept even existed, right? And as a result, our way of teaching and learning has been sustained over thousands of years, right? And as an Anishinaabe person, I have no right to tell the people of Kusupsum and Lekwungen territories how they should be learning, or what they should be educating, or what their way of being should be, right? That is their autonomous zone to do and to create and to be. And I think that's where what I see with students that come in with a background in those things is they have this beautiful way of seeing the world and being, but it's not always honored in the systems that we have, right? You know, here's somebody who can orally present their dissertation, their thesis, their thoughts with eloquence that can't be translated to a page. And now you ask this person to now create an essay or write an academic piece that isn't necessarily the way that they've come to be in relation to this knowledge, right? And so their function of transitioning these things from knowledge to wisdom gets lost in the systems that we've created, right? And I think that's where, when we think about in a national concept, is that even possible to go from coast to coast and say that these things need to be valued this way, and that we are going to give this a certain measure or weight within these spaces? You know, what is taught here around the ocean doesn't necessarily apply to people in, you know, the Capel Valley or back home in Buckhorn or Lakefield, you know? And I think this is where allowing ourselves to create and decide what's important within those separate nations will create a better foundation for engagement at a larger level, you know. Sorry, Elizabeth, I saw you unmute.
No, just to unmute to say absolutely. I mean, and I think that's the challenge, right? When people hear national, they think, oh my gosh, prescriptive, right? And you're going to tell me that I need to know about the ice melt in the northern Yukon, but I actually live in an 800 square foot condo on the waterfront in Toronto. And so they think that, and they think, oh, disconnect. And I think what I was trying to suggest was that this conversation, even the back and forth we're having right now, needs to be had at a national level so that more people can start to understand the subtleties and the complexities with which we talk about education in Canada, and then be able to make decisions around what would be the most useful for our next generations, right? Is it to leave it completely autonomous? Is it not? In the global context, will that hold them well or not? Will it hold us collectively globally well and I think that's where I'm coming from with respect to that, raising it to a national level, is from that standpoint.
Irwin?
I don't have a lot to add to those amazing comments and very, very important thoughts. One thing I'm thinking of in terms of a federal role, because obviously we have the distribution of powers in Canada and education over the provinces, but other than the Indigenous educational systems. And when you think about things like bandwidth and the digital divide and communications, which are really a federal responsibility, there's still a lot of work to be done. Still 15% of our country, and we're a highly developed country in the sense of economics. That there's still 50% of the country, and it's mostly remote and Indigenous communities that are suffering from this lack, when this has become such an intrinsic part of our ways of teaching now and learning. So I definitely think that's one area that we need to be very cautious and thoughtful about as we move forward. And if there needs to be continuing pressure, the question said 50%, it's 15%, yeah, 15. And I know that that collectively I believe it's colleges, Canada, and universities are trying to put pressure on the federal government to do that. But I think that's an area where we could do a lot better and think about a lobbying role as educators to get the infrastructure needed for justice and equity and education all across Canada.
Yeah,
oh, sorry.
No, Ken, go.
Just as a little follow-up to that, I've done some design for classes and programs where learners are in remote communities, and it took a mind shift for myself as well, because from a learning design standpoint, I think, oh, well, let's create a video that the learners can watch. And I had to be reminded by a colleague in the Northwest Territories who said, oh, if you put up a video, there are a number of learners who will have to set the video to download overnight, and then they won't be able to watch it till the next day. And if they have an internet connection that's robust enough to do that. So that, just keying into what you said, Irwin, that's very important, particularly as we're talking about online education. And that had to influence my design of that entire program.
Great. I'm conscious of the time and going to ask Christy maybe to put up the next slide. There's some more comments about this idea, this valuing of this idea of translating or thinking about knowledge to wisdom as opposed to just this accumulation of information, and this idea that a national focus might support highlighting the inequities in all the ways in which you've described them, including access and styles of learning and opportunities to learn. And I'll just read that out and then move on to this slide, which was a national focus would highlight inequities, but also put pressure for equitable resources, which I think is part of what that notion of understanding the conversation is, just that we need to actually resource these different ways of learning and different opportunities, etc. Agree, and so she goes on to say, agree on something like the UNESCO Sustainable Development Goals as curriculum. So I think in the context of this discussion, there are more, obviously, as always, more questions than answers, and in part this is contributing potentially to an ongoing conversation about how we look at and shape education moving forward in ways that are more transformative and more socially just, more equitable, and more really building on that potential for education as a tool of transformation in directions that we want, to create a world that we want, and in all the diversity of that. You know, there are some programs, we've talked about a number of programs and ideas that are happening at Royal Roads, and I think part of our call to action as panelists and as an institution may potentially be to deconstruct the institution, and at the same time to look for those places in the institution where we really can start shifting the conversation, shifting the ways in which we engage with education. And there are several examples. There are many examples of this at Royal Roads and many other institutions. There are many examples of good practice and not so good practice. I will say that this, we mentioned this graduate diploma and master's in arts and climate action leadership, and how this is integrating, really trying to weave in from the very beginning of the construction of a program, weave in this notion of valuing multiple perspectives, particularly looking to Indigenous perspectives and wisdoms around not only the content on climate and environment, but also in ways of learning. And Russ, you had mentioned, you know, not always relying on writing or one form of expression as a way of assessing learning. So really trying to weave that in from the start, and weave in this orientation to openness and transparency, and to really learning that engages with the community so that students are having an impact as they learn. We also mentioned the graduate diploma and masters of arts in, sorry, next slide, in learning and technology. And that's a place where you can go, as I said earlier, the first fully open online program at Royal Roads. And you can check out, it's a great example of open, where you can look at all the courses that are offered and really be exposed to some of the learning from students and instructors in that program. And so I think, as Stacy has said in the chat, 2030 is coming fast. Indeed it is. And there are many pushes and calls to action. And I think our call to action in this institution and in this space, whether we're learners, educators, as citizens, as community members, is to carry on this conversation and to really push ourselves to say, how can we participate in the changes that are needed, participate in, lead, stand with the changes that are so clearly needed in these systems, education being one of them, but you know, and how can we learn from what we are seeing today and integrate all of these great ideas that have come from panelists and from you as attendees in this transformation of education and really thinking about education's role in social transformation. And I guess, you know, when we were talking about this webinar, we really wanted to end on a call to action. I think the call to action is for all of us. We're all learners, we're all teachers, we're all wisdom holders, and you know, we're all actors in this grand adventure called being human. And I think we all have an opportunity to contribute to the kinds of shifts and changes that so many people are recognizing and calling for. So I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank all of you for joining us for this webinar. Here's the information, and this will be part of the recording if you want to get a hold of any of the panelists. And if you want to learn more about what's happening at Royal Roads, you can certainly contact any of us, but you can also contact enrollment advisors, international and otherwise, and just explore what's happening. And I think explore with that critical gaze, with that openness, and asking those important questions that you have been asking in the chat room and that have been posed by our panelists today. So thank you very much. Haishka Siem, and we will see you out there in the world making changes.